one of the reasons we age is because we have something called a telomere. They're caps on our chromosomes, right? And as the gene code reproduces, these caps on the chromosomes get shorter and shorter and shorter, right? And they start to fray. So how do we repair telomeres is a big field in anti-aging.
Massive question at the moment, yeah.
Right. And they did a comparison study. They looked at telomere length after 6 weeks of meditation, and they compared loving kindness meditation to focus meditation, focus on your breath meditation. And it turned out 6 weeks of loving kindness meditation, actually, your telomeres grow longer. It repairs your telomeres.
There goes a sight from my soul.
Welcome to the Inspired Evolution. And it is just like an absolute treat to be here again. We
Get me every time with the goddamn scream. Every time with the goddamn scream. I'm just saying. I'm totally chill. I'm all fine. So I'm interrupting the monologue.
The whole idea here was to just disrupt Stephen Kotler's zen, which he's been cultivating through having written so many award-winning books. It is actually insane. But nonetheless, even as a best-selling author and award-winning journalist, this amazing new book that he's written, I have really enjoyed, because I really enjoyed Last Tango in Cyberspace. And just, the foray into the fiction, just the ability that it gives Stephen Kotler license to actually try and bring the future up close and personal to us has been a real treat. So yeah, the new book has been an absolute treat, and I'm excited to dive deeper into that today. But really, Stephen's greatest passion is human potential and just what's possible in that space. And these books look at that in a real, creative way. He's also Flow Research Collective Executive Director and doing all the bad stuff around there. Really awesome to have you here, Stephen. Thank you so much for doing this with us today.
My pleasure. It's good to see you again.
Oh, bro. So where do we even begin on such a massive book? I guess the place where I wanted to start was this concept which is underlying the theme of the whole thing, speciesism, bro. Because last time we talked about Last Tango in Cyberspace, we walked away and I noticed empathy for all was this massive sort of war cry that came out of the book, and so much so that we named the last episode not Last Tango in Cyberspace, even though it was based on that book. We called the episode Empathy for All, because it was just this, man, it's just such a beautiful concept on all levels, spiritual, emotional, intellectual. Like, it really is like a panacea almost for our time. But this new book goes into a new direction where there is basically speciesism. Like, we talk about racism, and that's a massive issue, I know, in especially in the States, but also here in Australia, in the West. But then I found just it really interesting looking into the future where, we're eroding species, and we're finding ourselves in a conversation where there are people that are pro-human and pro-human excellence, and how that comes potentially even at a cost for the perspective of others at the price of Pachamama and Mother Earth. That was quite a rub to sort of sit with between the whole book. Your intentions around exploring some of that and what you felt going into that, bro?
You sort of nailed it. I mean, like, so we back into your question slightly, which is one of the goals in Last Tango and Devils, in the Devil's Dictionary, the new one, was to create a world, right? Our world 15 years, 20 years in the future, where the major environmental challenges, species die off, climate change, etc., had been solved. But I did not want a perfect utopia. I wanted our world with those things really solved. So what would it take? What kind of changes culturally, technologically, individually, psychologically, emotionally, all that stuff? And that was the question I was asking. I thought that was the sort of adult way to treat, these kinds of concepts. And one of the reasons I really wanted to do that is I sort of feel like, as an environmentalist who's been like covering as a writer, as a reporter, as running environmental organizations for 30 years now, and doing animal rights work and all this stuff on the front lines for so long, discussions about like, is climate change real? And like, how to, all like, I mean, like, what? Right? You know what I mean? And like, okay, you can go have those conversations.
You're allowed to have your
right?
perspectives.
But what I wanted to really talk about was like, holy crap, if we do solve these problems, what we're going to have, the changes we're going to have to go through as individuals are going to create whole new levels of problems, which is what you were looking at, like the rise and speciation. You know, this is not a new idea. You go back into sort of the writings of like animal rights folks and animal behavior experts in the 1970s, 80s, and 90s. There's a ton of stuff where they talk about the Bible says dominion over the beasts and, you know, speciation. And I will tell you, oddly, I'll give you one random example. So where this sort of still shows up in really odd ways. When my wife and I ran Rancho de Chihuahua in Chihuahua, New Mexico, when we built our dog sanctuary, we built it. We wanted to do all the stuff nobody wanted to do. And we wanted to work on the front lines in a very rural, very poor community with the highest instance of animal cruelty. And it's a very Catholic community. And as we were working there, people would get very angry with us. They would say, why are you helping dogs? You should be helping children. Dogs don't have souls. They don't matter. You should be helping kids. Kids need your help. And they would get mad at us. So like, you think this is the speciation is this like weird idea that like doesn't show up. And here I put it in the future.
Right.
But, like, it was in our face for like 10 years when we were in that community doing this work. People would routinely yell at us for not working with humans. So we saw that on one level, but I really, if you start empathy for all, which is still the core idea here, is, empathy for all humans, of course, but for plants, animals, and ecosystems. And in the sense, we're talking about equal rights for plants, animals, and ecosystems. We're starting to have that conversation, right? That's the conversation,
man. I love it.
And you could make, you can make really interesting arguments all the way across for it, against it, doesn't matter. But what you certainly know is if we were to start acting on it at a global level, there would be a huge outcry. There'd be a bunch of people who were like, what the fuck? You're helping plants, animals, and ecosystems, and humans are still dying. Like, what? Right? That would absolutely happen. There'd be a humans first movement, which is all I did in the book, is I created a humans first movement, and then I created an empathy for all movement. And, it mirrors, people have pointed out that it mirrors the tribalism of our times or whatever. And I think it mirrors, and this is what I talked about in the last tango a little bit, and this is what seems to get left out a little bit of some of the like implicit bias discussions and things like that, is that we don't have implicit biases. We have an us-them detector built into the brain. That's what the brain does.
Because you talk about this in the book.
Yeah, this is
us versus them.
It's foundational neuroscience. So you got to like understand that like whenever an organism meets another organism, right? The first thing it's got to ask is, are you like me or are you not like me? Because if you're like me, I may want to mate with you, or befriend you, we go hunt together or something like that. And if you're not like me, you might be my dinner or I might be your dinner, right? And so like me, not like me is the first thing the human brain, as soon as we detect motion, which is signal that something is alive, the next question we ask is the thing that's moving like me or not like me? And everything else that we talk about is built out of that. So when they talk about people reacting instinctively to people who are not the same color of their skin, yes, but it has nothing to do with the color of your skin. It has to do with like me or not like me. And more, here's the cool part, so there's like me and not like me, but how does the brain determine like me or not like me? Also, empathy is what determines it. You have something called the sphere of caring. Psychologists call it your sphere of caring, right? How wide do you care? Most people, it's their friends, their families, their loved ones, maybe their pets, goes out. Maybe it's their people in their hometown. Maybe it's their country, their religion, whatever, right? That's your sphere of caring.
Levels of compassion.
When you're outside the sphere of caring, the brain literally like shuts off perception. You don't get as much information. Like if you're inside my sphere of caring, you know what I mean? If you're a dog that I care about, So you get that information, you don't get that information too.
Yeah.
So it has a perceptual impact, but all that stuff stems from how wide is our sphere of caring, and how wide our sphere of caring is determined by how much empathy we feel. When we feel empathy for all, our sphere of caring widens out, and that us-them divide goes away.
Yeah, because that was going to be one of the big questions that I asked you from the book, because I was still wrapping my head around this them versus them concept, which is peppered throughout the book quite consistently, but actually wrapping my head and grounding into what is that really articulating towards. And it's almost what I'm hearing is a bias towards likeness, but it's not even a bias, because a bias makes it sound like it's much more prefrontal cortex, but like it's like a safety mechanism in your system, right? It's way more like we're talking amygdala almost, right?
No, it is. I mean, it's all this happens at the amygdala, but no higher. Like that's the top of where this information is getting processed.
Interesting.
You're talking about really primitive patterns early on in the pattern protection system. Stuff that is going to get recognize. I mean, some of this stuff can get triggered. Odor doesn't even pass those. So I don't know if you know this or not, but right, the brain, the thalamus is the router for the brain, right? All information comes in our senses, it goes to the thalamus, the brain, except goes elsewhere for processing, except for smells, which go right to the amygdala, basically. Like they're high. There's just so much information. Like we're talking about this us-them stuff. Like if they don't have the right pheromones, the them detector goes off, and
it's not happening.
It's not happening. Pre-conscious.
Yeah. It's and I find it interesting because in this space, the way you've unpacked this, it becomes really an opportunity for us to witness, just for me, I should probably speak for myself, my own judgments that arise of others and of their behaviors when, you really start to see the fine line between, okay, how much of this is I need a better word around it, but genetic makeup, how much of this is your amygdala and how much of this is your prefrontal cortex decision-making? Because it feels for me, if you've made a decision based on what you've constructed as your model of reality and there is potential for it to be a bit more enlightened, some part of me, as much as I'd like to be a spiritual being, finds myself judging you for some of the decisions. We talked about climate change. It's like, that's not a thing. It's like, oh man, do you know what I mean? But some of the more fundamental stuff that happens in the core of you, I'm easier accepting of other people because it's like, well, that's just the makeup of who they are. And it's interesting sort of seeing where we're making our decisions from and how others can accept us based on, there are some things that as human beings are innate to our biases, but there are certain biases which are then developed culturally. And I think the whole tracker concept is, again, a massive one when it comes to culture in this book. I love the fact that this dude just tunes into culture. There's a whole thing about his name line, which we'll talk about shortly. But one of the things that really stood out for me in this, which I forgot to sort of, I guess, I missed in the last book, was the fact that trackers are developed generally from a trauma-afflicted incident. So normally what happens is there's like a trauma-inflicted incident and then like something cracks them open and then they develop these extra, I want to call them extra sensory, but that may or may not be the right word, abilities. Now, I found that quite, I want to say poetic, but quite, I don't want to say harrowing either, but quite poignant is probably the right word. When I look at some of the work of like what Dr. Gabor Mate talks about as well, and going through like these challenges with trauma and how that actually opens up people in newer ways and trying to find kind of the blessings that are available to you through those challenges. It seems like an tracker is a superhuman version of that. Is there like the combination between cracking open trauma and then healing that into something that is more of use to, I guess, more egalitarian, more empathy for all sort of concepts?
It's interesting. The way I thought of it, and you sort of got there. So there's one. I thought of trackers, right? Like my protagonist is an tracker, and for those of you who are listening and didn't see the first episode, it's a genetic mutation that produces a wildly expanded sense of empathy. So my protagonist not only feels empathy for all humans, but he also feels empathy for plants, animals, and ecosystems, what we were talking about earlier, what psychologists or scientists talk about is nature relatedness. Or cross species empathy. And he also feels empathy for culture. It expands out. And the idea that there was a genetic, a new speciation, right? That this is a genetic break. So it's, first of all, that's not unusual, right? We live in a really weird time where there's we're the only hominid species right on Earth. But you go back any other time in the millions of years we've been on this planet as hominids, and there were lots of different Homo somethings, and or maybe we killed everybody else off, or maybe it was disease. Whatever the reason, we're the only ones left. That's weird. And I was talking to Dr. Andrew Hessel, who is a brilliant, he's a good friend of mine. But he was talking about how in Silicon Valley, especially in the early days, people who were more on the spectrum were getting jobs like never before, right? Because the math abilities that came with that were really prized. And he said, look, he said, nobody talks about this, but you're having people really hyper developed math abilities on the spectrum who under normal circumstances don't always get the guy or the girl they want. But now they are at the center of this culture and procreating, right? Like never mixing and procreating at a level that you could. What people don't get is once you're moving in that direction, if you keep moving in that direction, right, in a culture like Silicon Valley where those abilities are prized, it doesn't take long till you have what is a new species. Like the break, nature does this all the time, right? Like meaning like if you have two bird species and one migrates over the mountain, give it a couple of generations and they're different species. It doesn't take really long. This was his point. And so with M trackers, I was thinking about, there were a lot of people talk about themselves as empaths. And certainly if you spend a lot of time around animal welfare, animal rights, animal rescue,
it's hard
you
not
meet
to be
everybody from like animal communicators to of all sort, right? Whether or not they're I don't even know what's real. Let's just say they're hyper tuned to animal behavior and have wildly expanded senses of empathy towards animals that has perceptual consequences, which I write about a lot in The Small Furry Prey. Like we know that there's certain, because we co-evolved with wolves and co-evolved with so many animals, members of our species who sort of liked animals more than they liked humans were good for the species. Because if we were hunting with wolves, somebody had to really get along with the wolves, right? So like you didn't, and somebody had to really like the kids, and that was important skill sets. So there was all kinds of genetic precedents for these ideas. I just put them together. But with the trauma as an inciting incident, I always think, because I like what Gabor Mate has to say, but like I have certain problems with the culture of trauma right now, because some of the data is just wrong. And the main reason is that 90% of the time we go from trauma to post-traumatic growth, right? Post-traumatic stress disorder is really rare in the instance of trauma. The vast majority of the time, it's the Hemingway thing. The world breaks everyone, and afterwards many are stronger at the broken places. But the data shows it really is many, right? That's what happens to most of us. So when I was thinking about, we all know that when you go through trauma, you're broken open. You're much more, interior reception is turned up, self-awareness is turned up. You know what I mean? So I figured if something was going to bring on these empathic abilities, if this talent was there and was latent at all, and I was making up the world, so I get to pick. Right? Those were the things that I was thinking about.
I love that, because there's also this really remarkable thing that goes on with the M trackers and the empathy that they hold as this new species, that you start seeing society splinter on something as noble as empathy. which I found a really interesting sort of like this human first movement that evolved in the shadow of this empathy for all movement. And I was like, even with something, and it speaks so much to I think the dialectic of the kind of human condition, that even this us versus them versus them versus them, back to that you described, it was just, I found that so remarkable. I found
it really remarkable. It's also, a lot of this work spills directly out of the work I've done on flow.
It shows the book is so well written, and as
but flow automatically increases empathy and nature relatedness, and we know this. And it's not just flow; there's a group of altered states that do it. In fact, there's a recent paper out of Robert Card Harris's lab in Imperial College in London, right before he moved to UCSD. And left Imperial College, but he's the guy who did all the brain imaging on psychedelics. So like all the original psilocybin, LSD, MDMA, DMT, all the brain imaging stuff he did. I collaborated with his lab on a flow and psychedelics comparison and contrast study that we ran. But he was looking at, so what nature relatedness, which is how wide our sphere of caring extends, right? And do we see and perceive and care about the natural world? Psychedelics, especially if you do them outside, naturally expand nature relatedness. Now, here's the thing that is also cool. Nature relatedness goes up, environmental activism goes up in lockstep. So they're very empathy for the natural world directly leads to action. I had a conversation with Paul Zak, who's sort of the world's leading expert on oxytocin. He thinks it's an oxytocin reaction because oxytocin has been shown very profoundly to lead to action. Right? Yeah. Like we know when there's oxytocin, like in altruism studies, if they give you oxytocin nasal spray,
bro, I've had a newborn baby, and the stuff he's making me do just to preserve his survival is, the oxytocin. I totally get it. Yeah, that's palpable. Yeah.
So there's this direct relationship. Psychedelics seem to increase nature relatedness. Flow does, and so does love and kindness meditation. Which is and what's really cool about this is also, like, we understand where this happens in the brain. Like I can tell you like where in the brain empathy exists, how when our sphere of caring expands, like we sort of know, we have some idea of what that looks like, and how it's getting really these concepts that were so ephemeral for so long. There's now starting to be some really great neurobiology around them, and so now we can talk about things that 10 years ago would have been almost crazy talk, but we can talk about the neurobiological relationship between empathy, wisdom, and intuition. That's a real thing, right? It's a real thing. Right? I can even add in consciousness, and I'm still in the realm of science. I haven't I haven't yet jumped the shark, which is kind of cool. So all these questions that are so sort of philosophical, future forward philosophical, but they're right around the corner in terms of the world we're living into if we're going to start solving environmental challenges. And the reason, I always explain this to people, and we touched on it earlier, but why does all this stuff matter? It's a perception problem. So we take in 11 million bits of information a second. You pay attention to 126 bits once. That's how wide your attention span is. So 11 million down to 126 bits. Even consciousness, like everything you're aware of, is only about 2,000 bits. You pick and choose 126 bits out of 2,000.
Out of that 2,000.
But you just edit it out. And this is just signals coming into the senses. Forget, most of our internal signals are interior reception, your heartbeat, your all that stuff, all your internal thoughts. So it's, 20 million bits of information a second, and we're looking at 126. And the ratio, the negativity bias, because we're trying to stay alive and the amygdala is hyperreactive, is 9 to 1. So 9 of those 126 bits, 9 to 1 is stuff that scares you.
Yeah.
So what else gets through is only the stuff
makes
that
you feel
is
safe enough.
Fear of caring that I really love, that really matters to me. Because otherwise, fuck, I'm overloaded. and when you're really overloaded, to listen to me talk. 60 bits of 60 bits of RAM. So if you and I are talking at the same time, we're going back and forth fast. We're now at 120 bits. Pretty much anybody listening to us is maxed out.
Yeah. That makes sense. One of the interesting things is you're talking about psychedelics in there, especially when you're mapping consciousness. And I really like the question I would like to ask for myself is more about the quantum computing fields and the way we'll be able to map things with quantum computing and potentially understanding your consciousness more. But that's another question for another time. Right now, what I really wanted to ask is, you mentioned in the book, like there's this because obviously being the M tracker is an empathy sort of wizard, right? So he talks about these. He talks about, and you talk about. I don't know. Blah, 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 where does he begin and you end? The drugs of differing decades, and how there was LSD for an era, and then there was MDMA for an era, and we talk about the book goes and unpacks it a little bit further. Now, I found that just because of the context that the book was referring to it in, it was really like sort of whoa, like. Did the drugs influence an era's culture, or because, and this was
so
because the Carl Jung subconscious id call out that man, like it was just, I was just stuck in there, and I was like, I gotta ask Stephen.
You're asking, by the way, you just asked a great question, and I'm not sure, because here's how I was thinking of it. So there's something in psychology that sometimes you'll hear it referred to as the rebel instinct, which is basically like teenagers need to rebel, right? And we know that. And most people also, you have to rebel, that it's built in, and it's built in because what they want is the young males to get far away from the family as possible before they breed.
De-nest.
Right? Like that's the whole point, is incest is bad for the line. Go away, rebel. Need to be free, right? That's what that is. It's about like an argument against innocence, built into our gene pool. But one of the things that's been very interesting, and I don't know how far back it goes, but it certainly starts to show up in culture as far back as like sort of the Romantics, and really clearly from like the 50s on, is that every generation needs to out rebel the previous generation. It's like, in the X Games, it goes up and up and up. And you see this, the fashion is the easiest place to start. So like in the 50s, it was sort of like leather jackets and your hair was slicked back, right? White t-shirts. But it was a minimalist style. And like then in the 60s, it was, no, we're going to go farther. We're going to grow our hair really long, really wild clothing.
Wavy, flowy clothes.
Right. Yeah. And by the 70s, men are piercing their ears, and there's body modification. The punk crowd starts to come in, tattoos start to come in, it becomes a little more permanent, right? This progresses to these. By the 90s, like you got grunge, and like this is full scale body modification, scarring, all that stuff. Then you jump into the 2000s, and the cutting edge of those movements are now like the biohacker, where they're implanting, hardware into their body, turning people, and people are going into homemade cyborgs. And the point in Last Tango, the next rebellion through, is people starting to modify genetically human animal hybrids. And this is already going on. There are already genetics projects out there. I joke about it last time. I call it the Cat's Eye Project. That's a real thing. That's a hacker club right now, where they're trying to figure out how do you modify human eyes and turn them into cat's eyes, either just as cosmetics or with all the visual capabilities of cat's eyes. Like those already real things, right? So if you want to talk about like humans first versus, empathy for all, this is another one that's also coming, is human animal hybrids. And there's going to be a whole keep humans pure versus, we can now because you got to start asking yourself, how much giraffe DNA can I put in my system before I'm no longer human, right? And then do I need like giraffe human, right? Like these they seem nonsensical, but these are really close. These questions are from a punk rock, people doing this shit perspective. I'm not talking about like mass adoption, but like when it's possible, when it's coming, people are already trying to do this stuff. So it's coming in the next 10 years, 20 years. these are the kinds of questions I was like, okay, this is super interesting. I was thinking about the rebel instinct when I was thinking about psychedelics, because this is well known. Like there were mushrooms, sort of some of the plant stuff showed up first. Peyote actually showed up really early, and it's a pretty jagged, heavy psychedelic. But in the 60s, people were scared of DMT. They went nowhere near it. They're like, okay, this stuff is really, heavy. We're not, right? That we will do LSD, we'll do mushrooms. But by the, today, DMT is a party drug, right? People like bring DMT pens to parties. It's like, have a martini. Oh, go over here and have a hit of DMT, and I'll watch your body for 7 minutes while you float through the noosphere or whatever. And I mean, you're laughing, but I've been at those parties, and I don't even go out much. I have no social life. You know what I mean? So if I've been at those parties, lots of people have been at those parties.
Been there, yeah. It's interesting because you mentioned also body parts and animals, and I think the Cat's Eye Project is really interesting because there's a certain point in the book where I got stunned, and I know I'm going deep into like a real practical example. For those that will read it, it'll make a bit more sense, but I think the topic of conversation that will emerge from it is interesting nonetheless. So there's when the M-Tracker lion, he meets this polar bear, and he detects it because he's got this hypersensitive sign of vitality, his vital signs, his signs of life. So he can identify it because that's part of his M-Tracker sort of superpower, right? And so he identifies the polar bear as life. However, the polar bear actually, and I don't want to ruin it for anybody, but may not potentially be 100% life. But the key thing is why he ends up picking it up as life is because the amount of genetic engineering, the complexity, the gorgeous engineering that went into this particular animal's or non-animals' eyeballs and the way they were built. And I found that really intriguing as a concept once more, because it was like, we're already starting to pick, like you said, how much can we sub out of our humanness that is innate to the next thing? And then I was like, the eyes, window of a soul, the house of a soul, and then potentially him picking,
We'll get to the robot polar bears in a second. But, you know what I mean? Like, you gotta, you want to, like, there's a whole, so Japan leads the world in a couple of categories. First of all, they're the oldest society, and their replacement rate, meaning there are no kids. How to take care of the elderly population has been like at a crisis level issue in Japan for longer, and the robot industry has been in Japan for longer. So affective robotics, which is robots that create emotions, can produce empathy, can care for the elderly, all that stuff. They're the leader of this stuff. And you start to look at this stuff they're doing in like robo nursing, and you start to like, the line, not where we are today, but you move forward 5-10 years and you start getting real Westworld style questions about stuff, about like, because they talk about in robotics the uncanny valley, right? If you make a robot look too much like a human, if it's too perfect but not quite right, it nauseates us. We have a
repulsion,
literally. To it, and it's called the uncanny valley. They can get close to human, but like they get to a certain point and it makes us nauseous. And the question has been, well, what's setting off this gross out fear response? That's a primal. That's, by the way, that's usually a pheromonal response, because nausea usually comes in through odor or taste. So it's a really deep old, it's weird. So that's an ancient, like, you want to talk about the us them detector? That's an ancient signal. Ancient signal. So that, I know I'm not sort of answering your question. I was sort of like,
I'm enjoying the unpacking of where we're going. Yeah, go on. Yeah. The interesting thing from there also, which I don't know how to ask this question without sounding crazy. But man, like, let's just say hypothetically, I imagine, without even imagining, it's very hard to document a psychedelic trip, right? Like, let's just say you go on a psychedelic trip, you try and document it, you try and understand what's going on with your head. Obviously, the Flow Research Collective, its work that it's doing with psychedelics helps in a great deal. You trying to understand the biomechanics behind some of this. And there's a better way to ask this question, brother. But where do you
Say it
get
like
off?
a crazy man.
Well, where do you get off on coming up with new drugs and how they fucking operate? Like, how do you even like? Dude, I don't even know where to begin with the
Like,
question.
how did I
What
invent
the
a
fuck?
psychedelic? Yeah, how
Then
did I
you
invent
keep
it?
inventing psychedelics. Like first sage tava, and then you wait, and then
So-
even just the audacity to find that, like, yeah, I don't want to give away too much.
I
of the book,
created a
but then-
psychedelic that makes you trip
Oh.
evolution.
man, right?
So,
and then like,
well, one, it was this rebel instinct, right? Because I was saying, I had created Siege Tabor
yeah,
in the first book that allowed you to sort of feel animal consciousness and ride and do. So I had rebel instinct. I knew the next generation would want a stronger drug.
yeah.
So I had to do that, and two, I don't know how to. Okay, so.
yeah.
I wrote a book a number of years ago called Stealing Fire that talked about psychedelics.
Changed my
And
life
so the
after, actually.
psychedelic community has embraced me as one of theirs.
Mm.
So occasionally people reach out to me from deep in that community. Like I have to tell you, and I'm not like, I don't do a ton of psychedelics very often, but for like years afterwards, I would go out into the world and people would give me psychedelics. They just assume I'd go do a book reading and people would come and they say thank you and push something in my hand. I'd be like, that's illegal. Like, what are you doing? It's really fun. But I would meet these really cutting edge chemists who are working on. So the idea of a drug that radically increases nature relatedness, like we know psychedelics already do this. So I just like, I was like, okay, that knob is already in there. And I started to meet really weird folks on the like line between like chemists, shaman from planet from Pluto, right? Where the line was like they were working on drugs, and it was really hard to tell like what was real and what wasn't. Wow. And because if the stuff they were saying was real, wow, right? Like that would like the stuff that I talk about makes it sound lightweight compared to stuff that people are. So I was meeting these chemists who are working on really trippy shit. I also know, and from just work on technology, there's a 3D chem printer that's being developed in Scotland right now. We wrote about it in Futures Faster Than You Think. It was originally created for like the elderly who don't want to go to the drugstore to pick up their prescriptions. So couldn't use a 3D printer to print prescriptions at home for the elderly. And the Scottish campus at Edinburgh University decided that you could. It was like, well, then you just make a 3D chem printer that can make anything. And this is, like this project is moving along and it's going to show up some like early versions are starting to show up and we'll see this in the 2030s. So all I know is I've met some weird ass chemists who may or may not be telling the truth but they're willing to do these really crazy experiments. And on the other side, like the technology is getting realer and realer and realer to facilitate the lunatic guys I'm meeting. It's very, right? I mean, like, I don't even know what to call some of the folks.
I don't even know. Yeah, dude, when you
like, I don't know. I mean, you gotta like, guys were like, hey, I've gone out and I've ground up jaguar bone with the psychedelic, and you're just like, you did what? The jaguar bone? Like, can we, like, isn't that an endangered species?
Can we just pause?
Doesn't this defeat the purpose? Like, what's going on?
And then I was like, just let me tell you what happened.
Like, exactly, but like, I'm just saying, like, there are people out there who are doing stuff like that. And we're going to empower them with 3D chem printers. Yeah. So you don't think I mean, like, maybe I was audacious in coming up with new drugs, but like, I honestly think I was being fairly conservative compared to the stuff that I think is out there or coming. Like, I got to tell you, like,
you can't say that.
Shout out, like, really, like, I like it's better the farther I get from stealing fire, the less I have to deal with that. Right? But like, it's really like the last thing I care about is your ayahuasca trip. Please don't tell me about your dreams. Don't tell me about your flow experiences. And don't tell me about your ayahuasca trips. Like, I know that I draw the line. Not that they're bad. It's just that I don't want to hear about them.
Yeah. The incredible thing that I find is, because if I step back for a sec, it's interesting to sort of like look at the relationship of the psychedelics and and consciousness, because as you're describing newer psychedelics and using all the chemistry and the background of the mental mapping that you know from the Flow Research Collective, it really helps sort of the reader, myself, pick up on mental chemistry and how there's like what potential there is for me as a human being in a storytelling way, which I found a really great way to sort of start exploring. Oh, this part of my mind is prefrontal cortex. Oh, this part of my mind is amygdala. And it was just so, the story was teaching me, which I love storytelling as a method of learning. It's like the indigenous here in Australia. It's like their wisdom from like eons, right? Time immemorial, we've been learning that way. But the exploration of psychedelics and consciousness giving us a sort of intermediary step to then go, oh, what really is this architecture of consciousness? And the imagination of psychedelics that you've applied in this book gives us even more of an imagination of what's possible with consciousness, highlighted the sort of potential that psychedelics have for me with regards to supporting consciousness, at the risk of going into the stealing fire instead of working further out of it.
I'm not like, psychedelics give us a very unusual and interesting way to explore consciousness. And certainly like there's the shake the snow globe kind of whole side of this. And then there's just like really like weird questions. Like there's questions around disassociatives like ketamine and GABA, where it turns out there's this spectrum of consciousness that goes from I'm fully here to I'm totally disassociated, right? And there's psychedelics that move you along it. And those kinds of questions and how that gets mediated, how our experience, like that has, there's psychedelic, like ketamine give you that experience, but it has real like profound ramifications for questions around. So flow gives you the opposite. It gives you the what's called the watchtower effect, where you're pulled back from your consciousness, but you're perched above, and you have this expanded view. You can see sort of farther into the distance, and some of that has to do with prefrontal cortex being dialed back and a couple of impacts. But like those kinds of questions are really weird. Like, why is it that like we turn this one neurochemical knob and you're totally disassociated, you're a freaking K-hole, and like I can't find you at all until you come down. And in this other one, I've twirled the same knobs just slightly differently, and suddenly you're perched high above your life, and you've got perspective and wisdom, and you can see. And I'm not saying one is better than the other at all. I'm just saying that those are really interesting and weird ass knobs, and who knew they existed in the human brain?
Exactly.
And, right. Like that's all. Like I don't have that. So that like there's all the stuff you're talking about, which I think, that's been true since people started playing with psychedelics in prehistory, and you know what I mean. Like, does it? One of the things that I find again and again and again, and it's why I find that it's interesting and fun as psychedelics can sometimes be in a, wow, that was an interesting and unusual insight. I find that I always end up having the same half a dozen insights in some variation of, and they're good insights. I'm glad I've had them, but none of them are ever actionable. Like I have experiences in flow and they turn into books. They turn into companies. They turn into relationships. They turn into, and I have experiences, and they don't even really turn into ideas. They turn into like things that I think might be true about the universe, but I can neither confirm nor deny. And you'll never get me to talk about this stuff out loud, right? In at least not in public, kind of thing, because I can't. It's just an opinion. I'm just a guy with an opinion. Right. I did drugs and now I've got an opinion. That's like, okay, that doesn't make me special. I definitely don't talk about that in public, you know?
Yeah. I wanted to dive into this kind of concept that we have of sort of this primary productivity. Maybe I'll give you the space to sort of explain what primary productivity is. Towards the end of the book, you talk about Stanford and Pym's, the Stanford research and some of the Pym stuff, and the primary productivity of the human species. Because I think even the fact that the whole book weaves into this concept towards the end, I think is I found myself chewing on that bit for quite a while. And 40% of the Earth's primary productivity being dedicated to human. What is primary productivity, Stephen?
So everything on the planet Earth lives on sunlight.
Yeah.
Sunlight is the primary fuel. We either eat plants, turn sunlight into sugars. So we either eat plants or we eat animals that eat plants.
Yeah.
How much sunlight gets turned into plant matter is the planet's primary productivity. It's the breadbasket of the Earth. So how much food does the Earth produce in any given year? We are in the middle of the sixth great extinction. Species die-off rates are 1,000 times greater than ever before in history. And, by the end of the century, 50% of all the large mammals on Earth are going to be gone, and so forth and so forth. And why is this? And it's because we humans, a single species out of billions, consume, and these numbers are now out of date because they're 15 years old, but in 15 years ago, we consumed 43% of the planet's primary productivity. So like all the food there is, one species out of millions has stolen all the food. Like why are species die-off rates 1,000? And
they got no food.
That idea, Richard Manning is a great nature writer who I quote in the book, and he says, he points out, he's like, look, this is why species die-off rates are so great. We've stolen the food, the rich among us, a lot more than everybody else. Right, is his point. So like, if you are living anywhere near a first world lifestyle, and I'm pointing a finger directly at myself on this one, you know what I mean? Like, it's an issue. But like the notion of primary productivity, first of all, Stuart Pym, who's one of the guys, there are two efforts to calculate the primary productivity. Stuart Pym's one, and the other came out of Stanford. He's an awesome researcher, so I've known his work for a while, and it's been really impactful. But I always thought that, like, I found personally in years of trying to communicate about environmental issues and animal rights issues and things like that with the public, with varying degrees of failure and success. I was found, like, if you're an animal lover or a nature lover, and I start talking about species die off, you light up. I'm preaching to the choir, but if you're not, if you're right in the humans first category on any level, right, it doesn't. None of this registers. And I have to tell you, this is really funny, but I started to notice this, like. When Peter Diamandis and myself were writing Abundance, I was at Singularity University, and we were doing the research. And this was the second class at Singularity University, right? And the people in that class had come from all over the world. They were brilliant. They were being taught by like visionary Silicon Valley folks, and I had just written a small furry prayer, and I think it was best known in the world. Like, maybe these people knew some of my writing, whatever, but like, I was the animal side. I was the dog guy. You know what I mean? It was writing a book with Peter to a lot of these people because they didn't know, like, they hadn't read West of Jesus. They weren't a surfer. They were like, nobody read my first novel anyway. So like, I was a tech writer and a science writer and like the dog guy, right? And I would have these conversations with these brilliant minds about like animal rights issues, and like they were super animated on any other conversation, but then you'd start talking about animals or plants, and they just fade to black, like they just went away. And it was those kinds of things that I was looking at. I was like, well, how do you that's the divide I want to cross, because like
Yeah.
those are the people who have the power. If they could start seeing, because they were saying all the right things, I just knew they weren't like, they didn't see, like they literally weren't processing the information, and so like
Yeah.
they weren't, it wasn't coming in.
Yeah.
And you know, it's odd. I was thinking about the first time I went something I learned from my wife, which is like the first time I was hiking my wife, and like, you know, we live in the desert and we're hiking spider webs everywhere in the desert, which like Joy would go out of her way to walk around the spider webs. And it's hard to do, especially when you're walking 20 dogs. And she was like, look, those are hard to make. There's a lot of energy that goes, that spider puts a lot of time and effort and energy into the web. And I went, oh, like that was a level of empathy for all that I was like, oh, that goes, okay. And now I do that. I just, have you ever read Braiding Sweetgrass? Do you know, have you read the book Braiding Sweetgrass?
No, but I've heard about it.
So it's just a beautiful, she's a botanist and a Native American and a scientist, and she brings the two theories together. But she takes empathy for all and these ideas so much. Like I thought I took them as far, you know what I mean, as you can sort of push on them. And then I read Braiding Sweetgrass. She's got a chapter in there where she talks about the world from the perspective of rain and rain consciousness. And I had never stopped to consider.
Man, you gotta love indigenous wisdom, right?
Does all the water have consciousness, or is it the entire rain cloud? And this is, by the way, what I liked about it is my wife and I have conversations, because plant consciousness and plant neuroscience is a real field, right?
People are studying
plants
on the
process
reg.
information with the same neurochemicals we do. They exhibit empathy, right? They feel the altruism. They're all kinds of, they process information in real time with pheromones, and like there's a really interesting argument for plant consciousness. I don't know where I fall on it, but the argument is very interesting. And plant neuroscience is a huge burgeoning, cool, super amazing field. And, you know, my wife and I will have conversations like, okay, plants are conscious. Is it like, is the entire aspen grove conscious, or is an individual tree conscious? Is it the tree or the branch or the leaf? Like at what level of scale does the plant become conscious? If you're dealing with, I live in northern Nevada in the high desert. We live in a sea of sage, and like, is it they talk about the sagebrush sea? Well, is the entire sea? It's like, is it the individual plant? What
where does
level
the
is
individuate
consciousness?
and where does it start individuating?
These are not totally, like, these are a little sci-fi, but just a little. And like some of the questions start to get real, right? Like consciousness may be the wrong word, but anyways, I think these are one. I love the thinking in and around this stuff. Even like the reason I mentioned Robin's book is it's wonderful to start seeing people take it farther. Or Richard Powers' book, The Overstory, where he, you know, tells the book, the first 110 pages are from the perspective of the forest, which I don't think anybody's ever done before, you know, in literature. And it's mind blowing. It's a great book. But you're really starting to see these ideas enter into literature and into consciousness at a much, you know what I mean? This is not
taking root. Yeah, literally.
Well, it bummed me out in a sense, like Avatar can't be the end all be all ultimate environmental statement to come out of sci-fi. You know what I mean? Like it's fine, but like it's sort of beginner level thinking, right? Like we did that in the Lorax. I love the Lorax, changed my life, but I read it when I was 4, right?
Yeah.
But it totally changed my life.
We need to evolve continually. Yeah.
I'm just saying that like there are new questions out there.
I love these questions. I want to make sure that I ask this particular question. quench myself with a question, this question of you today. There's this interesting piece about the future, especially what it brings into light when we were looking at it in the book. And it does harken a lot back to flow, but
Sorry, did you harken in a sentence? That was impressive. Play through.
The sacred commodity that is attention. Yeah, the sacred commodity that is attention, because it's forever being vied for. Even looking at the likes of Z and Sir Richard in the book, the work that they're doing to map the mind, and that's not too dissimilar to, I guess, all the social media giants that are living out there in the world right now. But nonetheless, the scale at which they're operating in the book is futuristic. So the key thing, and it was just written in like really beautiful, short, succinct way in the book, but so poetically put, that the takeaway for me was like the trigger, like just understanding your triggers for where you zip off and zip back in, zip off and zip back in. That attention management is so important. And I think, especially at this juncture in this conversation, we've touched on such big topics. And like you said, there are certain people where you're tuning in and you're having this important conversation, but it's just the trigger's just not like, it's just not being picked up on the other side. And I think that attention management, and knowing what I know, having followed your work for quite a while, how important it is to actually devote yourself.
This wasn't those folks. It wasn't attention management. It was literally empathy, sphere of caring stuff. Like I crossed outside. So it doesn't matter what I say. They literally, it's a cognitive bias. They literally, if there's not processing it, it wasn't there. They were paying plenty of attention to me, but it's a sphere of caring thing. But it does remind me. So the third way to train up empathy is love and kindness meditation, right? And the work on that, it's Tibetan practice originally. It's Tibetan Buddhist practice, but it's what the work that Richie Davidson has done at the University of Wisconsin, my alma mater, go Badgers, on love and kindness meditation is sort of astounding in terms of how it changes the brain. And the reason I'm coming off what you said and mentioning it again is, one, it's known to expand empathy, but the thing that it does that is real, first of all, it trains down cognitive bias. So, and it's very effective at that. But interestingly, it makes our automatic behavior, our habits, our triggers, what you just said, to come off to really visible. And I've been meditating and studying meditation for 30 years. I've used every different kind of system.
Yeah, we talked about this in previous episodes.
And I stayed away from loving kindness meditation forever because I was like, dude, this is like you're praying for people. Like I can't, like I don't like it feels weird. Like I don't like
fluffy dice off my dashboard.
Well, it was. I was looking at Richard Davidson's data. I was doing an interview on the Flow Research Collective Radio with Dan Goldman, who worked with Richard, and so I was really looking at the data on compassion meditation. And it's wild. Like, I'll give you the weirdest one. So, one of the reasons we age is because we have something called a telomere. They're caps on our chromosomes, right? And as the gene code reproduces, these caps on the chromosomes get shorter and shorter and shorter, right? And they start to fray. So how do we repair telomeres is a big field in anti-aging.
Massive question at the moment, yeah.
Right. So somebody, I'm going to forget where they did the study. I have it written down. The study was, we want to see, like, there was all the meditation is good for this and good for this and good for this. And actually it's got physiological, not just psychological benefits. So somebody was like, okay, let's look at aging. And they did a comparison study. They looked at telomere length after 6 weeks of meditation. And they compared loving kindness meditation to focus meditation, focus on your breath meditation. And it turned out 6 weeks of loving kindness meditation, actually, your telomeres grow longer. It repairs your telomeres. And it halts telomere attrition, whereas focused meditation does not. So, like, it's really like, but I mean, if you look at Richard Davis, so like the part of your brain that does empathy is the temporal junction. It's right here. And it does a lot of stuff. It does empathy, but it also does out-of-body experiences. When you have an out-of-body experience, why is that? It's because empathy is about perspective. So is an out-of-body experience. An out-of-body experience, physical perspective changes, right? Empathy, your cognitive perspective changes. And it turns out the same part of the brain handles both, which makes some sense when you actually think about it, but is really, really weird, right? So this is why, you know, when they do all that, like there's a whole bunch of, there's a lab in Switzerland that can produce out-of-body experiences now, and it's all by messing with the temporal parietal junction in different ways. In fact, you can trick it in VR and have doppelganger experiences, which is doppelganger is another altered state phenomenon where you see, instead of leaving your body and hovering above yourself, you project your physical body into space. So you see a copy of yourself. And in certain mystical traditions, including Kabbalistic Judaism, you can ask your doppelganger questions and use your doppelganger as like a soothsayer. Yeah, so there was a great study done at Jerusalem University by my friend Shahar Arzi, who's a neuroscientist who teamed up with Moshe Adel, one of the world's leading experts on Kabbalah. And because there's this really complicated Kabbalistic practice that is supposed to produce the doppelganger effect. And Shahar Arzi had come out of the lab in Switzerland where they had created out-of-body experiences.
Just created this,
oh wow, this has got to be the same phenomenon. So let's try to reproduce it. And they did. And so they've got neural imaging work, fMRI work on what goes on in the brain while you're having a doppelganger, while you're literally seeing yourself, you know, which is it's incredible. Our ability to, it's what's this, you know, this is some of the work that informs the novels, of course, but it's just amazing to me because I so remember my early conversations with Dr. Andrew Newberg, who sort of got me into the science of this work back in the late 90s and early thousands. And I remember having conversations like, do you think we'll ever answer these questions or this question? I was just a young, I must have been like the most annoying neuro geek, just like endless questions. I remember like at one point, this was a totally different thing, but Patricia Wright, who's a MacArthur Genius Award-winning primatologist, got trapped in a car with me for 3 hours. She's become a very good friend of mine, but she loves to tell this story because she had never met before. And I was like, how often do you get access to a MacArthur-winning Genius Award-winning primatologist? And for 3 hours, I just peppered her with question after question after question. I wouldn't stop.
Oh, man. I love that.
But I remember asking Andy Newberg, I was like, do you think we'll ever, you know, solve some of these things? And I was even just talking about simple flow stuff. I wasn't talking about like, you think we're going to decode the doppelganger? I'm like, it's crazy how far this field has come
in such a short amount of time as well. Like it's been phenomenal. Stephen, it's been phenomenal having you here again as always, brother. Man, it is honestly always
fun talking to you. I don't know if anybody listening likes this conversation at all, but it's always fun to talk to you.
Oh man, it's they're super well received, so it means the world to me to enjoy these conversations with you and share them on with the world. And specifically, just especially these last two on the fiction writings, like I said at the beginning, just the ability of scope that it gives the mind to grow into. Like I think I'm butchering an Einstein quote, but the power of how important imagination really is. And I think especially feeling into my truth in this time, like just where the world's at, there's a lot of action that needs to be taken. And I think we need to get imaginative about what's really possible rather than sort of being stuck in the boxes of what's being fed to us in terms of what, you know, is the kind of mainstream norm at the moment. And this book, both books especially, sort of help us expand potentially what's possible for us as a species when we're our most evolved self. And you know how much inspired evolution means to me. So thank you so much for writing the books. I'll put links to the books in the show notes below. So if you're interested in a book, I highly, highly give it a recommend. There's this interesting point in the book where Confucius is standing right between Tony Robbins and Jack Canfield, and Deepak Chopra gets shot in the head right between the eyes, and Eckhart Tolle cops a bullet to the gut as well. So if you want to understand more about what the fuck I just said, please do check out the book.
That is so funny. that you're the first person. So a couple other people have slyly mentioned that to me in passing. Like, you sort of went to town on the self-help industry, Stephen. And I'm like, I don't know what you're talking about.
But it does it with a lot of grace, so go figure. So please check out the book. And Stephen, man, thank you so much again for being here, sharing yourself with us today. And I know it's not just today, like you said, it's 3-hour car rides where you're peppering people with questions that don't want to be asked over a whole lifetime's worth of experience. All the work you put into, like the dogs, the care, the heart, even just all the work that you dedicate to us helping understand our mind and our neurology and our human optimal performance better. Man, it is always such a pleasure. Thank you so much.
That was a lot of words. I don't have any idea what you just said, but it sounded really good. Thank you. It was a pleasure hanging out with you once again.
Much love. Hey guys, if you enjoyed this video, give it a like, leave us a comment. And if you want to stay in tune for the new episodes launching every Monday, hit subscribe and I'll see you in the next video. Stay inspired to evolve.